Imagine this, you're sitting in the most luxurious seat in the sky, enjoying a peaceful flight, when suddenly you're told to move. The reason, not because you've done anything wrong, but simply because of the way you look. What would you do if someone tried to take away your rightful place, based on nothing but prejudice? Today, we uncover a story that not only shook the foundations of a high-class airline, but also sparked a nationwide conversation about fairness, respect, and standing up for what's right. This is the powerful story of Ethan Blackwood, a 17-year-old student who refused to back down, and how one act of courage changed everything. Let's dive into this shocking story, and together, let's discover the true meaning of justice. It was just an ordinary flight for Ethan Blackwood, a 17-year-old student from a prestigious family. His father, James Blackwood, a successful CEO, had booked a first-class seat for him on Skylux Airlines, a luxury airline known for its impeccable service. Jordan had done everything right. He arrived at the gate on time, had his ticket ready, and settled into his assigned seat, 2A. It should have been a smooth and comfortable flight, but little did Jordan know, this flight would become the stage for a confrontation that would expose a deep-seated injustice. Jordan sat back in his seat, adjusting his black headphones, ready to watch his favorite show on his iPad. His outfit was simple, a casual shirt and jeans, nothing fancy. But for Jordan, that was perfectly fine. He had learned from his father that the value of a person wasn't determined by what they wore or how they looked. Still, as he adjusted himself in the plush seat, he felt something was off. A well-dressed woman, Vanessa Aldridge, stood impatiently by his side. She was a regular on this route, and this seat, C2A, was her seat. At least, that's what she believed. "Excuse me, young man," Karen said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You need to move. This seat is reserved for VIP guests." Jordan looked up, startled by the interruption. He had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, standing over him with an expression that screamed entitlement. He glanced at his ticket once again, confirming that seat 2A was indeed assigned to him. With a polite but firm tone, Jordan replied, "No, Mom, this is my seat, 2A. But Karen wouldn't let it go. She muttered under her breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "I always sit here. This is my seat. I don't know why they let you sit here." Her words were sharp, laced with a sense of superiority that Jordan could feel in his gut. Just then, the flight attendant, Ava Caldwell, approached. She looked at Jordan with a polite smile that quickly faded as she saw the tension between him and Karen. Ava Caldwell turned to Karen, as though Jordan wasn't even there. "What seems to be the problem?" she asked. Karen, with a smirk, pointed at Jordan. "He's in my seat. I've been sitting in 2A for years. And now, he's here?" Ava Caldwell glanced at Jordan's ticket, but said nothing for a moment. She then turned to Jordan with a skeptical expression. "Young man, I think there's been a mistake," she said coldly. "This seat is for VIPs. You shouldn't be here." The way she said those words cut through Jordan like a knife. VIPs? He was a VIP, wasn't he? He paid for this seat, and his father's name was as good as any others. But somehow, he felt like he wasn't wanted here. As he showed Ava Caldwell his ticket again, her eyes flicked to his name, Ethan Blackwood, and for a brief moment, Jordan caught a flicker of unease in her eyes. But it quickly passed. The atmosphere in the cabin thickened. Some passengers began to murmur. The tension was palpable. Jordan could feel the eyes on him, but he stood firm. "I'm sorry, but this is my seat. If she has a problem, she can check the system herself." Karen, now visibly annoyed, muttered something about VIP customers as if Jordan weren't even worthy of the same respect. She stepped closer to Ava Caldwell, who was still looking at Jordan with an expression of doubt. Then, Karen did something that caught everyone by surprise. She slipped Ava Caldwell a small envelope filled with cash. It was so quick, so discreet, that no one but Jordan saw it. But Jordan saw it all. The bribery, the injustice, the system that would rather see a young black man removed from his rightful place than confront its own prejudice. Ava Caldwell, now clearly under Karen's influence, turned to Jordan again, her voice cold and calculating. "I really think you should move," she said, her patience running thin. "This is a VIP seat, and we need to keep things moving." Jordan's heart raced. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about something much bigger. It was about respect. It was about equality. It was about standing up for himself in a world that had too often tried to knock him down. Jordan knew he couldn't back down now, not when everything in him screamed that this was wrong. The tension grew as Jordan's eyes locked with Ava Caldwell's. She expected him to back down. She expected him to move, to make way for the important passenger. But Jordan wasn't going to do it. "Not now. Not ever. I'm not going anywhere," Jordan said firmly. "This is my seat. I paid for it. If you have a problem, take it up with the airline." As Ava Caldwell hesitated, the situation was escalating quickly. It was no longer just a disagreement between two people. It was a clash of values, a young man fighting for the dignity he deserved, against a system that thought it could push him aside simply because of the color of his skin. But Jordan didn't falter. He stood there, resolute, not moving an inch. And in that moment, a fire was lit. This wasn't just about one seat on one flight. This was about fighting for justice in a world that was too often unfair. The room was silent. The passengers watched, some with phones out, recording the scene unfolding before them. Jordan's calm confidence began to shift the atmosphere. His bravery wasn't just a personal stand. It was a statement to everyone in that room and to everyone who would watch the footage later, that he wasn't going to be intimidated. He wasn't going to be silenced. He was standing up for his right to be seen, heard, and respected. By the time the captain arrived, the tension had reached a breaking point. This wasn't just a fight for a seat anymore. It was a battle for fairness, and Ethan Blackwood, with nothing but his calm demeanor and unshakable belief in what was right, had just become the symbol of a fight that was much bigger than himself. Stay tuned for the next part of this extraordinary story, where the consequences of this single moment will rock Skylux Airlines to its core, and Jordan's struggle will inspire a worldwide movement for change. Imagine the entire room holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. What happens when a simple moment of injustice spirals into a life-changing battle? This isn't just about a seat on a plane anymore. It's about respect, dignity, and standing up to a system that believes it can control you. In this part of the story, the consequences of one decision unfold, changing everything. Are you ready to see how one young man's bravery will turn the tables on the powerful? After the tense confrontation in the first-class cabin, Ethan Blackwood had become more than just a young man fighting for his seat. He had become the symbol of resistance. As he stood his ground, the atmosphere shifted. The once quiet cabin now filled with anticipation. Ethan could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, their phones discreetly recording the scene. In that moment, it was no longer about the seat. It was about his dignity, his right to exist without being judged by the way he looked. And when Mason Blake, the supervisor, arrived, he brought with him the weight of the system that thought it could crush Ethan without a second thought. But Ethan wouldn't let it. Mason's approach was deliberate, his large frame cutting through the aisle with authority. He towered over Ethan, his strong jawline set in a stern line. There was no kindness in his gaze, only the coldness of someone who had long accepted their power. "Listen, kid, you need to move. This is not a negotiation," Mason's voice rumbled, filled with the weight of someone used to getting their way. But Ethan remained unshaken, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the pressure Mason tried to impose. "I'm not going anywhere. This is my seat," Ethan replied firmly, his voice steady, his resolve unwavering. As the conversation escalated, the tension in the cabin was palpable. It was as though the entire plane had frozen, eyes glued to the drama unfolding. Vanessa Aldridge, the woman who had caused this mess, stood by, her smug expression now a thin veneer over the frustration bubbling inside her. She had expected Mason to handle this quickly, to remove the problem and restore the comfort she was used to. But the situation wasn't as simple as she had thought. As Mason barked orders, Ethan stood firm, showing a level of maturity and dignity that both unsettled and impressed the onlookers. This wasn't just a flight for Ethan. It had become a stand for what was right. "Do you know who I am?" Vanessa finally piped up, her voice dripping with entitlement. "I'm a VIP customer. I should not have to deal with this." Ethan's eyes met hers for a moment, and then he turned his attention back to Mason. "My seat is clearly assigned. If she wants to cause a problem, let her take it up with the airline. I'm not moving." Mason wasn't used to defiance. He wasn't accustomed to anyone challenging him, especially not someone who seemed so out of place in first class. But Ethan wasn't just a passenger. He was a force to be reckoned with, standing tall and proud in the face of authority. "Do you really want to escalate this?" Mason pressed, his voice cold. "Because if you don't leave now, we'll have to remove you from the plane. Do you want that kind of trouble?" Ethan's gaze was unwavering, and the other passengers continued to watch, their discomfort growing. The whole situation was unfolding in front of them, and many began to whisper among themselves. Was this really happening? Was this really how the airline treated its customers? Just as the tension reached its peak, the flight attendants began to take sides. Ava Caldwell, the young flight attendant, stood between the two men, trying to placate the situation, but her indecision was palpable. She had been taught to respect authority, but this was different. Ethan wasn't just any passenger. He was a person with dignity, with rights, and Ava could feel the pressure building as she realized she was caught between doing what was right and following the chain of command. Suddenly, the cabin door opened, and Captain Gregory Hayes stepped onto the scene. His presence was commanding. The seasoned pilot, dressed immaculately in his uniform, had a reputation for maintaining order in any situation. His face was a mask of professionalism, but his eyes held something else, something cold. "What's going on here?" Captain Hayes asked, his voice cutting through the tension. Ava quickly explained, but it was clear she was losing confidence in her decision. She had been swayed by authority, but now the weight of the situation was too much to bear. The entire plane was watching, waiting for one of them to back down, but Ethan wasn't going to give in. His quiet confidence, his calm demeanor, made it impossible for anyone to dismiss him. Vanessa, frustrated by the lack of immediate action, stepped forward, once again trying to manipulate the situation. "This is ridiculous. I demand that you remove him from my seat." But Ethan, despite the pressure, remained unmoved. "I'm not leaving. I paid for this seat. This is my rightful place, and I won't let anyone take that away from me." In the moments that followed, Ethan's defiance set in motion a chain of events that would change the course of his life and the airlines. Mason Blake, who had initially sided with Vanessa, found himself facing an uncomfortable truth. His blind adherence to the system had failed him. Ethan wasn't just some rebellious passenger. He was standing up for what was right, and the weight of that became clear to everyone in the cabin. But the story didn't end there. As the confrontation subsided, word spread throughout the airline, and soon it was more than just a simple seating dispute. News outlets began to pick up the story. Social media exploded with reactions from passengers and onlookers. Ethan's bravery had sparked something larger than the confrontation itself. It had ignited a movement. As the flight continued, it was clear that things would never be the same for Skylux Airlines. Ethan's refusal to back down wasn't just a personal victory. It was a victory for fairness, for equality, and for the power of standing up in the face of injustice. The moment Ethan Blackwood stood firm in the face of injustice, he didn't just challenge authority, he challenged the system. He sent a powerful message to everyone on that plane, and soon, to the world, that no one should ever be made to feel inferior, no matter their background or appearance. And while the airline's executives scrambled to manage the fallout, Ethan knew that this was only the beginning of a larger fight for justice. Stay tuned for the next part of the story, where the aftermath of Ethan's brave stand will reverberate far beyond the first-class cabin. Sometimes, the world doesn't change overnight, but sometimes, it changes because of one pivotal moment, a moment where someone stands up and dares to defy an unjust system. In this chapter, the ripple effect of Ethan Blackwood's stand spreads far beyond the cabin. What happens when the powerful are forced to confront their own corruption? The fallouts, the regrets, the consequences. This is the part where the real story begins. After the confrontation on the plane, Ethan's actions reverberated far beyond the walls of the Skylux Airlines jet. His refusal to back down had already begun spreading through the internet like wildfire. Passengers had recorded the entire exchange, capturing the exact moment he stood his ground. Before long, news outlets picked up the story, and social media was buzzing with reactions. The headlines screamed out, "Young black student kicked off first-class seat for white VIP customer. Racism exposed in airline incident." The video of Ethan's firm stand against the flight attendants, Ethan Blackwood, and Vanessa Aldridge quickly went viral, reaching millions of people around the globe. The hashtags flooded Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Hashtag justice for Ethan, hashtag Skylux racism, hashtag not just as eat. As the video spread, reactions were mixed. Some praised Ethan's bravery, while others criticized Skylux Airlines for allowing such an incident to escalate. The attention forced Skylux into a difficult position. They could no longer sweep the situation under the rug. The pressure was building from all sides. At Skylux Airlines headquarters, the atmosphere was tense. Richard Williams, the CEO, sat in his office, watching the video of Ethan's confrontation with a mixture of anger and disbelief. He was no stranger to media storms, but this one felt different. It wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a public indictment of his company's deep-seated issues. How did this happen? Richard muttered to himself as he watched the footage again. This isn't just about a seat. This is about something much deeper. The boardroom was filled with senior executives, anxiously awaiting Richard's response. They had seen the stock price drop sharply in just a few hours, with investors pulling out and news outlets digging into the story. The fallout was too large to ignore. Richard knew that Skylux Airlines couldn't survive if the situation was mishandled. As a seasoned CEO, he knew what needed to be done. But this wasn't about damage control anymore. It was about addressing a systemic issue that had been festering beneath the surface for years. After hours of heated discussions, Richard made the decision. We will issue an official apology, and not just to Ethan Blackwood, but to every customer who has been unfairly treated in the past. I want a full investigation into this incident and into the conduct of our staff. This is going to change. The internal investigation was swift, but the damage had already been done. Ethan's confrontation had forced everyone at Skylux to take a hard look at their practices. The flight attendants, Ethan Blackwood, and Captain Gregory Hayes all came under scrutiny for their roles in the debacle. The question everyone asked was, how had they allowed something so blatant to happen? Meanwhile, Ethan Blackwood's name was beginning to circulate more widely. He was interviewed by various media outlets, his calm demeanor in the face of adversity earning him respect from people across the world. But behind the calm exterior, Ethan was struggling with the aftershock of what had happened. He had never asked to be in the spotlight. All he had wanted was to enjoy his flight in peace. But now his name was everywhere, and he couldn't escape it. However, one thing became clear. Ethan wasn't going to back down. His fight for fairness had inspired countless others who had faced similar discrimination. Soon, people began sharing their own stories of unfair treatment on flights, in workplaces, and in public spaces, calling for accountability. Vanessa Aldridge, once the epitome of entitlement and privilege, was now facing the consequences of her actions. Her name was dragged through the mud as more people watched the video and learned about her arrogant behavior. Vanessa had always prided herself on her status, But now she was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. Within hours of the incident going viral, Vanessa was suspended from her position at her high-end company. An internal memo was leaked, showing that her actions had been reported, and HR was investigating her behavior. Vanessa's social circles began to fall apart. People who once praised her now distanced themselves. The power she had wielded with a simple glance was now gone. The same hand that had once given Ethan the cold shoulder now trembled as she scrolled through the endless emails and messages condemning her. The walls she had so carefully built around herself began to crack, and she realized that her world had shifted. Her reputation, so carefully constructed over decades, had come crashing down because of her arrogance and sense of entitlement. Mason Blake, the airline's supervisor who had been the enforcer of the system, found himself facing a personal crisis. He had always prided himself on maintaining order and upholding the airline's policies. But in this case, he had sided with the wrong people. His involvement in the incident became the focal point of public outrage, and soon, calls for his resignation began to flood in. But the most damning thing for Mason was the realization that he wasn't just a victim of circumstance, he had been a willing participant in a system that perpetuated inequality. The company had long ignored its own internal issues, and now Mason was paying the price for that neglect. His once unshakable confidence now wavered. Mason had built his career on the idea that authority should be respected at all costs. But in this case, that philosophy had been completely undermined. The system he had upheld had failed him, and the consequences were far-reaching. As the media frenzy continued to escalate, Ethan's father, James Blackwood, took matters into his own hands. As a successful businessman, he understood the power of influence. His company, a major player in the tech industry, had a significant relationship with Skylux Airlines. But that was no longer enough. Ethan's dignity, his future, was at stake. James knew that the only way to address the situation properly was through action. He scheduled a high-profile meeting with Richard Williams, the CEO of Skylux Airlines. The stakes were high, and James wasn't just going to sit back and allow this to pass. He had already pulled his company's partnership with Skylux, and now he wanted a formal apology not just to his son, but to the entire public. This wasn't about money or leverage. This was about ensuring that Ethan's experience didn't go unnoticed. It was about ensuring that no one else would face the same mistreatment. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the actions of a few individuals had caused a systemic failure. Skylux Airlines was at a crossroads. Would they continue to uphold their reputation as a luxury airline, or would they take a hard look at the culture within the company and make real changes? James Blackwood's meeting with Richard Williams was just the beginning. Ethan's stand had forced the company to reckon with its flaws and take the first step toward a much-needed transformation. But what would happen next? Would the airline be able to regain the trust of its customers, or would it crumble under the weight of its own failures? The fallout from this incident was far from over. It had only just begun. In the aftermath of Ethan Blackwood's brave stand, the true cost of injustice began to surface. People who had once stood above the system were now being held accountable for their actions. The world was watching, and the pressure was mounting on Skylux Airlines to make meaningful changes. But Ethan's journey was far from over. As the battle for fairness continued, one thing was clear. Ethan Blackwood wasn't just fighting for a seat on a plane. He was fighting for something much larger: respect, dignity, and the right to be treated as an equal. Stay tuned for the next chapter of Ethan's fight, where the stakes continue to rise, and the battle for justice becomes even more intense. Have you ever wondered what happens when the truth refuses to stay hidden? What happens when people who have long been in power must face their darkest secrets? This is the turning point, the moment when Skylux Airlines is forced to confront the consequences of their actions. And Ethan Blackwood's fight for justice sets the stage for a much larger battle. Are you ready to see how the system crumbles and how one young man's courage sparks a revolution? Ethan Blackwood had become more than just the young man who refused to move from his seat. His stand against Skylux Airlines had grown into a global movement. The viral video of the confrontation had reached millions, and it wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about justice, fairness, and the fight against systemic inequality. As the pressure on Skylux mounted, it became clear that they could no longer ignore the situation. The airline's leadership was scrambling to control the narrative, but the damage had already been done. Ethan's bravery had opened a door, and now there was no going back. Social media was flooded with messages of support for Ethan, and people from all walks of life began sharing their own stories of discrimination. Ethan had become a beacon of hope for those who had long been silenced. The conversation around equality, race, and the power dynamics in the corporate world gained momentum, and Ethan was at the center of it all. In Skylux Airlines corporate offices, the mood was one of urgency and panic. Richard Williams, the CEO, had never faced a crisis of this magnitude before. The company's reputation, built over decades, was unraveling before his eyes. In an emergency board meeting, Richard and his team of executives discussed the fallout. The stock price had plummeted, and the public was outraged. The internal investigation had already begun, and it was clear that the actions of several employees, including flight attendants, Mason Blake, and Captain Gregory Hayes, had contributed to the situation. Richard knew that he needed to act quickly, but he also understood that it wasn't enough to simply issue a public apology. Skylux needed to make real changes. He called for a complete overhaul of the airline's policies and promised to implement anti-bias training for all employees. However, the real test lay in whether these changes would be enough to repair the damage done. Meanwhile, James Blackwood, Ethan's father, was using his influence to ensure that this wasn't just a passing scandal. As a successful businessman with significant ties to the airline industry, James knew that he had the power to push for accountability at the highest levels. James had already withdrawn his company's support for Skylux, but now he was focused on making sure the airline faced real consequences. He was in constant contact with Richard Williams, demanding that the company take concrete steps to address the issue. James wasn't just doing this for his son. He was doing it for the thousands of people who had been unfairly treated by systems like Skylux Airlines. Through his relentless push, James was able to secure a seat at the table for a public discussion on race, fairness, and corporate responsibility. This was no longer about the Blackwoods or even Skylux. It was about an industry-wide reckoning. Ethan's fight had become a catalyst for change, and James was ensuring that the conversation didn't die down. As Skylux Airlines struggled to control the damage, Vanessa Aldridge, who had once held such power and privilege, found herself in a spiral of public disgrace. Her name was everywhere, but it wasn't in the headlines for the reasons she had hoped. The video of her bullying Ethan and her subsequent actions had turned her into a symbol of entitlement and injustice. Vanessa's suspension was just the beginning of her fall. Her employer, the luxury brand she had worked so hard to maintain her status with, was forced to distance itself from her. The social circles that once revered her now whispered behind her back, and she felt the weight of public scorn in every corner of her life. Vanessa had always believed that her wealth and status would protect her, but now she realized that there were consequences to the way she treated others. The arrogance that had once served her was now her undoing. As her career crumbled, Vanessa was forced to face a harsh truth: power is fragile, and it can be stripped away in an instant. Mason Blake, the airline's supervisor who had been complicit in the mistreatment of Ethan, also faced his own reckoning. His actions during the flight, including siding with Vanessa and dismissing Ethan's rights, had not gone unnoticed. The internal investigation revealed his role in the incident, and soon, the public knew about it too. Mason had built his career in maintaining order and enforcing company policy, but when he sided with the wrong party, he crossed a line that he could never come back from. His position at Skylux was quickly terminated, and his professional reputation was tarnished beyond repair. No longer the authority figure he once was, Mason was left to reflect on the consequences of his actions. The job offers dried up, and the industry that once respected him now turned its back on him. He was left to question how he had allowed his sense of duty to cloud his moral compass. The fall from grace was swift and unforgiving as the investigation continued and Skylux Airlines scrambled to rebuild. The public's perception of the company shifted dramatically. What had once been a beloved luxury airline was now a symbol of inequality and injustice. The conversation around race and privilege became more intense, and the corporate world was forced to reckon with its own biases. Ethan Blackwood's stand had sparked something bigger than just a public scandal. It had ignited a global conversation about fairness, equality, and the power of standing up against a broken system. People from all walks of life began to ask themselves, what kind of world do we want to live in? With the global spotlight now focused on Skylux Airlines, the pressure was mounting for them to make meaningful changes. Richard Williams, though burdened by the crisis, understood that this was the moment to do more than just protect the company's interests. This was an opportunity to create real, lasting change. A full reformation of Skylux's corporate culture was underway. New policies were being implemented, and all employees, top executives, flight attendants, and pilots would undergo anti-bias and anti-racism training. This wasn't just about salvaging the company's reputation. It was about creating a system where equality wasn't just an afterthought, but a priority. And while Skylux Airlines was taking the first steps towards change, Ethan's fight was far from over. His journey had only just begun. What started as a fight for a seat had turned into a fight for something much bigger, a fight for justice. The fallout from Ethan Blackwood's stand against injustice was just the beginning of a larger movement. Skylux Airlines faced a reckoning, and individuals who had once held power were now being held accountable for their actions. But the real change was yet to come. Ethan's bravery had set the stage for a global conversation about fairness, equality, and the power of standing up against a broken system. As the pressure on Skylux increased, and the company made attempts to rebuild, Ethan's fight for justice only gained more momentum. This was no longer about one young man's moment of bravery, it was about a larger cultural shift. The battle had only just begun, and Ethan was ready for whatever came next. What happens when one man's fight for justice turns into a global reckoning? When the corruption of an entire system is laid bare, and the public demands change, no one can hide from the truth. The wheels of transformation are now in motion, and the battle for fairness reaches new heights. But will the powerful acknowledge the change, or will they continue to stand in the way? This chapter marks a turning point, where Ethan Blackwood's courage becomes the spark for a revolution of fairness. The viral video had done more than just expose Skylux Airlines' flaws. Ethan Blackwood's refusal to back down had sparked a conversation that could no longer be contained within the walls of the airline industry. As the media frenzy continued to escalate, the story of racial injustice and corporate failure quickly went beyond just one airline. People around the world were rallying behind Ethan, calling for change not only at Skylux Airlines, but in all industries that had fostered inequality. Public pressure mounted as protests began to erupt in cities across the globe. People were demanding accountability not only from the airline, but from the individuals who had been complicit in Ethan's mistreatment. His story resonated with millions who had faced similar experiences, and now the conversation was expanding to include every system that prioritized the privileged over the marginalized. Ethan's courage had unlocked something powerful, a call for justice that couldn't be ignored. As the story spread across social media, major news outlets scrambled to cover the fallout. Skylux Airlines found itself under the microscope like never before. Headlines around the world read, "Skylux Airlines faces backlash over racism and discrimination scandal. Young man refuses to give up seat." Sparks global conversation about racial injustice. Corporate culture at Skylux Airlines under fire amid allegations of bias and corruption. The coverage of the incident wasn't limited to just the United States. It went global. Media outlets in Europe, Asia, and Africa were covering the story, discussing the systemic racism that allowed such treatment to take place. Ethan's stand had become a symbol, and the conversation surrounding it was being discussed in boardrooms, classrooms, and living rooms across the world. The conversation had changed the narrative of corporate power. Now, instead of seeing powerful CEOs like Richard Williams as untouchable, people began asking, who really controls the system? Internally, Skylux Airlines was struggling to manage the public backlash. The company's executives were in crisis mode, holding emergency meetings, drafting apologies, and trying to regain control over the narrative. Richard Williams, still reeling from the impact of Ethan's actions, was facing mounting pressure from investors, clients, and the public. But as the days wore on, it became clear that no amount of apologies or corporate spin could erase the damage that had been done. Skylux Airlines, a company once regarded as a luxurious, elite airline, now faced accusations of systemic bias. The trust they had worked so hard to build over the years was crumbling, and their reputation was in tatters. Public confidence had shifted, and the airline found itself losing customers, especially among the younger, more socially conscious generation. Travelers who had once flocked to Skylux's luxurious services now turned their attention elsewhere, choosing airlines that demonstrated a commitment to equality and social responsibility. The pressure on Skylux to make real, meaningful changes became overwhelming. Richard Williams, as the head of the company, knew the full extent of what had happened. He was no stranger to crisis management. But this situation was different. His company wasn't just facing a financial hit, it was facing a moral reckoning. He called another emergency meeting with the company's senior leadership team. This time, however, the stakes were higher. It wasn't just about regaining the public's favor. It was about addressing a culture that had allowed such incidents to happen. He knew that in order for Skylux to survive, real changes needed to be made. We've failed our customers, our employees, and our society at large. Richard began in the meeting. This goes beyond business as usual. If we want to move forward, we need to look at every part of this company, its leadership, its policies, its culture, and change it. We will implement anti-racism training for everyone in the company, from top to bottom, and we will hold those responsible for the incident accountable. But there was more to be done. Richard knew the process would be long and difficult, and there would be pushback along the way. However, it was clear that Skylux Airlines had reached a pivotal moment. The company could either change or become a relic of a past that no longer existed. As Skylux Airlines began making its internal changes, Vanessa Aldridge and Mason Blake faced their own downfall. The public had already cast their judgment, and the damage to their careers was irreversible. Vanessa's name was tarnished beyond repair, and her suspension from her high-end company was just the beginning. Mason Blake, once a respected figure within Skylux, found himself out of a job. His role in the incident had led to his immediate termination, and no other company in the airline industry would touch him. The career he had worked so hard to build had evaporated in an instant. But for both Vanessa and Mason, the loss of their positions was only the beginning. The real cost of their actions was the loss of their reputations, their standing in society, and the relationships that they had once taken for granted. For them, the consequences were harsh, but they were also a necessary part of the process of change. Throughout all of this, Ethan Blackwood remained steadfast. His role in the movement had grown beyond just that one moment on the plane. He had become a symbol of resistance, a figurehead for the fight against corporate corruption, and a rallying point for those who had been silenced for far too long. Ethan's family stood by him, and his father, James Blackwood, continued to leverage his influence to ensure that the conversation around fairness and equality didn't fade into the background. James' decision to work closely with Richard Williams to help guide the company through this moment of reckoning was pivotal. Together, they were pushing for a systemic shift, not just within Skylux, but across industries. But as Ethan continued his fight, he realized that his journey was not just about the injustice he had faced, it was about a larger societal shift that needed to happen. This wasn't just about one man or one company. This was about creating a world where everyone was treated with fairness and dignity, no matter their background. The global conversation ignited by Ethan Blackwood's stand was beginning to make waves. Skylux Airlines was being forced to reckon with its past. But the question remained, could the company truly change? Could they rebuild the trust they had lost? Or would they become another cautionary tale of corporate failure? As the world watched, the battle for justice, fairness, and equality continued. Ethan's story wasn't over yet. In fact, it had just begun.